Thank you. Layoffs in McPherson today. Dozens of people learned they are losing their jobs. Digital anchor Keith Grant joining us with the latest on the situation at Pfizer.
Yeah, Mike. Pfizer confirming those layoffs in McPherson earlier today. The pharmaceutical company citing a recent assessment of its programs to decide where layoffs would happen. Now, Pfizer says the layoffs will not affect production at the facility. Kansas Workforce One confirming with us that at least 80 people lost their jobs, so that's about 4% of the workforce there. Talking with Kansas Workforce One today, the organization seems optimistic that those laid off will find new jobs easily.
Pfizer, Lagco, employers like that tend to have a lot of longevity, so meaning they've been there for quite a while. So they're doing something right. If they have that long of longevity with one employer, they're skilled, they're trainable, so that should transfer over to the next employer.
Kansas Workforce One revealing they first learned about the layoffs last Friday. The organization will help those laid off find new jobs.